Welcome into Sportsmemo's betting podcast. We're talking college football, SEC East preview with Rob Veno. We'll break down all 7 teams in order of how they finished last year, so you can scroll through however you'd like if you're looking to listen to your team, or hopefully listening to the whole podcast here. We'll go Georgia down to Tennessee. That was the standings last year. But Rob Veno, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
I am doing great today, Drew. How about yourself?
Never too early to talk college football, Robbie. I'm doing good today and excited to get your analysis here on the SEC East. We can start off at the top, man. What you're seeing here with the Georgia Bulldogs, 7-1 in conference last year, 11-3 overall. They were 7-0 at home, 3-1 on the road. We remember that loss to LSU. And also down the stretch, didn't look too good, this Georgia Bulldog team. But what are you seeing here, their 2019 outlook, Robbie? We got Jake Fromm at the helm, one of the top quarterbacks in the country. And to me, it seems like a team under Kirby Smart. They've recruited like heck, not many teams better than them. And not really... They're reloading, Robbie, in Athens, Georgia. It's a fun party town. It will likely have a lot of wins under its belt this year. But what are you seeing here in Athens this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot more of the same, right? And it's my belief that, we have programs like Alabama, which constantly reloads. Now we have Clemson. Those are the top 2 programs in the country at this point. Another situation where they just reload. And I really think that, Georgia has put themselves in that same position. Each and every year now, we're just going to see Georgia have great recruiting classes. It's amazing how quickly Kirby Smart built this to where it's at right now. But I don't think they're going anywhere. They're going to be the favorite inside this division for at least the next few years. I mean, Dan Mullen is a couple steps behind at Florida, but he's coming. And the rest of the litter here are pretty much in chase mode as far as winning this division is concerned. So Georgia's going to be your top team, Drew. If you just go off of power ratings, let's say my closing power ratings for 2018, and you're looking to see what the gap is within SEC East teams, well, Georgia on a neutral field to close the season would have been 10.5. over Florida, the next closest team. So that's the kind of separation you're looking at now. Perhaps Florida closes it a little bit this year, but I wouldn't count on that too much. It looks to me like Georgia with Jake Fromm, who some people now, Drew, surprisingly to me when I was going through some notes last night and this morning, but surprisingly I've seen some very, very early, way too early, 2020 mock drafts that have Jake Fromm as the number 1 quarterback coming out next year. I think I saw him drafted as high as 4th ahead of Tua at Alabama, who I think we would assume would be the higher draft choice. But right now, Jake Fromm, by some at least, graded as the top quarterback. Hey, they had some key losses over the course of this past week with the inside the draft, especially at the wide receiver position where Riley Ridley and Mecole Hardman were both drafted. But like I say, with the recruiting that's going on down there, these positions are easily filled, and maybe Georgia just leans on the running game a little bit more this year, right? If they have to. I mean, for Georgia, they potentially could have the best running game. Certainly, it looks like they'll have the best ground game inside the SEC East. They have the potential to have the best ground game in all of the SEC with DeAndre Swift leading the way. So only a sophomore. It's hard to find a position group on this team, Drew, and I know we could nitpick, but it's hard to find a position group on this team that needs a lot of help. Georgia Bulldog fans obviously will zero in on one thing or another that they don't believe is up to snuff to catch Alabama. But, from a betting perspective, I closed the season with Georgia ranked number 3 in the country power rating wise. I don't see any reason that would change here. They're going to be inside the top 5 for sure. So going to be another good year for Georgia barring injury. Looks to me like when you have the veteran quarterback, the top-notch running back, you can fill in the receivers, and the defense looks to be very good once again. So schedule-wise, We could take a quick look. I know that they have Notre Dame, but it's home in Athens. That's a good spot for them. The crossover games, which are real important inside the SEC, you have to play two teams. If you're in the East, you play two from the West. If you're in the West, you play two from the East. But the crossovers here for Georgia are difficult. They have to go to Auburn, which is not going to be an easy task. And then at home, they'll get Texas A&M under Jimbo Fisher. Did a lot of good things last year and should be improved this year. So those are on back-to-back weeks, which makes scheduling at the end of the year a hair bit difficult. We'll see how it goes for Georgia, but I wouldn't expect them to be any cheaper priced if we just look at it from, the gambling, the sports betting angle here, which we look at it from. I don't expect them to be any cheaper priced, and I don't know that point spread wise we could expect any major improvement or descent in their point spread record, unless the odds makers go a little bit crazy, Drew, and really overprice this Georgia team due to public money coming in on the squad. So for Georgia, it looks like much of the same. It's one of those top tier teams at this point in time. There's really not much when you discuss them. I think now from year to year, much the way we discuss Alabama, I don't think there's going to be much that we're able to say unless one year they really get gutted by graduation.
Yeah, Robbie, and you bring up the schedule, and you're right. Not every SEC schedule is created equally. It's something that college football bettors know. I will say this though. I think it's more important to know the crossovers. It's important either way, but more important for the West teams, just because the discrepancy between how wide the gap is between Georgia and, let's say, Tennessee from last year was very far, whereas in the West, it's a little bit more heavy hitters out there. Their schedule does set up pretty well, in my opinion. At Vandy week 1, that will be a fun one to watch, getting off the gates there with an SEC opponent on the road in Nashville. They got Arkansas State from the Sun Belt. Won't be necessarily a cakewalk, but they should be able to handle that. And Notre Dame, like you bring up, and then they'll get the off week and head pretty much into SEC play. Their homecoming game is Kentucky, which Kentucky finished second place in the SEC East, so I thought that was interesting. But down the stretch, they do have a tough schedule. You bring up at Auburn, Texas A&M, at Georgia Tech. They are at Bobby Dodd this year. With Georgia Tech getting a new coach, that could be interesting. And then versus Florida as well. They do get an off week before the largest outdoor cocktail party. But I don't think there's any doubt Georgia is the favorite to win the SEC East. And the team that is second, Robbie, surprisingly, is the Kentucky Wildcats, which we'll talk next. They were 5-3 in conference and 10-3 overall. I believe this was the first 10-win season for the Kentucky Wildcats since the 1970s. They were 6-1 at home, won 3 down the stretch. And I'll tell you this, Robbie, they got it turned around. They looked good. They were talented. It wasn't just a fluke. They manhandled Florida early on in Gainesville to kind of their coming out party, so to speak. And this year's schedule, Toledo, what Toledo's been able to do there in the MAC has been impressive in years past. Not sure the Rockets program this year. And guys, if you're listening just because it's the SEC East, we will be breaking down every conference in college football, so stay tuned to the Sportsmemo podcast for that. But back to Kentucky's scheduling here. They got Eastern Michigan, Florida, at Mississippi State, all before the bye week. And then their West opponents are Arkansas and not seeing the other one off the top of the head here, but Robbie, and Mississippi State. But Robbie, what's your view here on the Kentucky Wildcats this year? Are you looking to bet on, or do you think they'll kind of have a regression after last year's 10-win season?
Yeah, this is a team where it could go either way here, Drew. Real quick, just for the listeners that want to that we're focusing in on Georgia, I just want to go over one quick point that we left out, which will be important as we go through the rest of this division here, Drew. I don't know that these changes make a whole heck of a lot of difference, but the one thing I didn't talk about that I wanted to was the coordinator changes. Georgia has 2 new coordinators this year, promoted from within. No system changes on either side of the ball. James Coley's going to take over as the offensive coordinator. Dan Lanning is going to take over as the defensive coordinator. So we have two guys that are going to come in and just pick up the same offense, the same defense, and run them as they were. Not too much of a shift going on in Georgia. It's important because we'll talk about Kentucky here with the same thing. Kentucky's going to have a new defensive coordinator, Brad White. Now, a lot of these moves are because, the previous coordinators took other jobs. In the case of Kentucky, Matt House, their defensive coordinator last year, the guy who improved that defense so much, he accepted a job with the Kansas City Chiefs in the NFL. He's going to go be their linebackers coach. So now we get Brad White, again, a promotion from within, the outside linebackers coach here. Not a lot expected to change. I can give you a couple of things I picked up from him as far as quotes were concerned. The only thing of note that I got from Brad White was that he said there may be some subtle nuances in the way he does his game day play calling, only due to feel and flow of the contest. So, he's in there to run this defense the way it's been run, and every game day play caller is a little bit different, Drew. They react in different ways, but you're not going to see any major differences here with this team. I think the biggest problem, Alabama's built to sustain personnel losses in the draft. Georgia's built to sustain personnel losses in the draft. To an extent, Florida's built to sustain personnel losses. LSU, a lot of those teams in the West, same thing. Kentucky's not built to sustain personnel losses in the draft, and they had some monster ones. If you look on their defensive side of the football, where they made so much improvement last year, Josh Allen, first round, 7th pick overall defensive end, not on the team anymore. Lonnie Johnson Jr., their top cornerback, 2nd round, 54th pick overall. Strong safety Mike Edwards, 3rd round. They had 3 guys on defense inside the top 100. Rare for Kentucky. Now, all indications is that Mike Stoops has a lot of talent there, and if you watch defensive coordinator Brad White in a couple of interviews, he'll tell you they've got the talent. They just need people to step up into leadership roles that are all voided by the loss of Josh Allen, by the loss of Lonnie Johnson Jr., by the loss of Mike Edwards. So they need some guys to step up and do it on the field. Talent is one thing. Working as a unit is something entirely different. We'll see if Kentucky – I have my doubts as to whether they can be as successful on the defensive side of the football as they were last year. And we'll throw in one more major loss to the Pittsburgh Steelers, 122nd draft pick Benny Snell, who was the heart and soul of that Kentucky offense. Terry Wilson last year, Drew, the Kentucky team was not a great downfield passing team. They weren't a great passing team overall, mostly run, dependent upon Snell. They won a few close games where Benny Snell was the difference maker. And now you don't have him, and now you may have to lean on Terry Wilson to throw it a little more, or Terry Wilson to run it a little more. It's going to be an interesting year for head coach Stoops and this program to see if they can. In my estimation, they're certainly not going to, repeat the straight up 1-loss record that they had last year. Once again, we'll see how odds makers treat them, whether the power rating is severely dropped because of the losses, but. Kentucky's not like those other top-notch SEC programs. It's going to be a pretty good coaching job out of Mark Stoops here. He's got to get that defense to fill some gaping holes, and also, like I say, leadership on offense, where Benny Snell just took over some games and helped that offense out when they couldn't produce points but could produce just enough, a la the Missouri game, to go ahead and win the contest outright.
We're talking with Robbie Veno from Sportsmemo.com, on Twitter at Rob Veno Sports. I'm Drew Martin at Drew Martin Bets on Twitter. Feel free to reach out to either one of us. Any questions you want answered on the podcast. We'll move down the line here, Robbie. We got the Florida Gators, which tied Kentucky at 5-3 in conference. Also 10-3 overall straight up record. They did lose to Kentucky, however, previously mentioned, and they didn't look good in that loss against Kentucky. But I will say this about Florida: they turned it around, and look like a lot better team in the second half of the season, in my opinion. Looking at this year's schedule, they start off, Robbie, on August 24th, which I believe is that week 0, where there's not many other games, and they play, I don't know the other games that week, but versus Miami in Orlando. So somewhat neutral site game here against an in-state opponent. That will be a big one. Night game to start off the season. They do get a bye week after that until the SEC schedule starts. Their permanent opponent from the West is LSU, and they also draw Auburn from the West as well. So kind of a tough draw there outside of Alabama. Pretty tough spots there with both Tigers from the West. Robbie, what are you thinking here with the Florida Gators? You know, you mentioned that they might be reeling Georgia in as far as top-notch in the SEC East. I don't think they're there yet, but they have made strides. Good recruiting from Dan Mullen. Also a good quarterback coaching job, in my opinion, there in Gainesville. And I think the future's bright for this Florida Gators program. It's just, if they're really going to be a bet on this year, I think we'll find out early. Some early lines I saw in that opening week game was about 7.5 point favorites over the Miami Hurricanes. So we should be able to find out pretty early on with this Florida Gators team. But what are you thinking this year in Gainesville?
Yeah, I'm with you, Drew. Like I said earlier, if we went off of closing power ratings for last year, they'd be 10.5-point dogs on a neutral field to Georgia, but that 10.5 could be chipped away at this year because it is Dan Mullen's second year, and because, as you mentioned, his second half of the year showed great improvement, including the bowl game, right? Felipe Franks looked like the quarterback that everybody thought he was going to be towards the end of the season, especially, Michigan's not an easy defense. And Florida played well in that game. So the recruiting class was good. The haul was good here. You get another year inside this system. This team, unlike I don't want to say the other two teams that we talked about earlier with coordinator changes, become unstable because of those coaching changes. They were promotions from within. But Florida, Dan Mullen brought his guys from Mississippi State, and here they are in their second year. So the kids that are in the program are 2 years into the system. Normally second year, it flows even better. The playbooks are easier understood by everybody returning. And Florida, because of the early game on August the 24th that you mentioned against Miami, which will be played in Orlando Camping World Stadium, they get 3 bye weeks this year. Immediately after that game, they draw a bye before they play Tennessee Martin, which should be easy. So that's 3 weeks to get ready, or 2 weeks, to get ready for the SEC East opener against Kentucky, and they'll then play Kentucky and Tennessee back-to-back, and after 4 more games, they'll have another bye week on October 26th, and then a third bye week before they play Florida State on the 23rd. So a lot of rest for Florida this year with the 3 byes, even though they play early. I guess you could say that anybody who doesn't play on week 0, in theory has a bye, that Florida doesn't. But for the Gators, it looks like a schedule that they'll be able to, at least if they have injured players, they'll have time to heal up with some of these bye weeks. They get to, play Georgia off of a bye week, which will be nice, and they'll get to play Florida State off of a bye week, which will be nice here. Their schedule is a little bit difficult, though. Certainly, as you mentioned, Auburn and LSU back-to-back out of the SEC West on October 5th and 12th. That could be a very meaningful 2-game set for these Florida Gators. We'll see what Auburn does this year, and maybe Florida and Auburn are more evenly matched this time around, but that's a tough pair of games to go through right there. Love what Mullen's done on offense. Love what Todd Grantham's done with the defense. And certainly, like I say, after a few down years, it appears to be that Florida's back in the game here in the SEC East with Georgia. You mentioned earlier that the numbers that we see floating around right now for that Miami of Florida game was 7.5 on a neutral field. That looks about right with the power ratings from last year that I keep it. It's a little bit padded towards the Florida Gators because I would show them as a 6-point favorite. So 7.5 shows a little bit of love for Florida, and maybe not as much for Miami, but it'll be interesting to see where that line goes.
Robbie, let's move down the card. We got South Carolina, the Gamecocks, up next. 4-4 conference record, 7-6 overall. I believe lost their bowl game last year. And looking at their schedule this year, they got North Carolina to start off on the 31st. Also, they draw Alabama from the West, so that's a tough draw for them. And at Georgia this year, they do get Florida at home, at Tennessee, also at Texas A&M from the West as well. And then they do get a bye game before having to play the Clemson Tigers. So they got to play both national championship teams in Alabama and Clemson because of the state they're in and the conference they're in. Also, the Georgia Bulldogs. Man, there aren't many schedules in the country that are going to be tougher than the South Carolina Gamecocks. And I don't know, Robbie. What are you thinking here with South Carolina? I would say about an average year for them last year. Probably could be bounce back, but with this schedule, an 8-4 would be a great season almost.
Yeah, and I was reading an article, Drew, that South Carolina extended the contract of their athletic director yesterday, and apparently there's a little bit of tension between Will Muschamp, and the AD, to where a couple articles I read say that this is an extremely important year for Will Muschamp. You wouldn't think he'd be on the hot seat right now off of last year. He was willing to switch the offense and go up tempo. It resulted in a year where, for betting purposes, they wound up going 8-4 over the total, and their last 4 games of the season posted pretty high point totals: 48 against Mississippi, 31 against Florida, which was a good defense, 49 against Tennessee Chattanooga. But how about the 35 they ended the season on, the regular season on, that they put on Clemson?
I believe over 400 passing yards as well in that game, right? Yeah,
that was a game where Jake Bentley had come out during the week and said that they thought they saw some things on film that they could capitalize. I remember this like it was yesterday because I ran with it and used a 5-star over on that game or 5% on that game, and they did. They went up and down the field. Now, they couldn't stop Clemson, but the offense, Will Muschamp is an old dinosaur of sorts when it comes to offense, and he begrudgingly went to the up-tempo offense to keep with the times. The year before they were supposed to do it, got into it about 3 games. He backed off. Finally, Brian McClendon, the OC, got his way, and they look pretty good doing it. And Jake Bentley, third-year quarterback, running it, they could be very, very explosive again offensively. But I think you bring up the great equalizer, which is their schedule, which is really difficult here. As improved as South Carolina may be on both sides of the football, it could be negated by the fact that they have so many difficult games. I mean, when you just stop and think that Georgia and Florida are games where they're going to be underdog to begin with. One of those is played on the road. And then, as you mentioned, the Alabama game, the Clemson game, that's 4 out of 12 where they're automatically underdog. Have to go to Texas A&M as a crossover game in College Station where they're likely to be an underdog. That's 5 times they're going to be dogs. We'll see where they come up, but when they go to Columbia, Missouri, perhaps they're an underdog at Missouri. So it's a tough schedule for sure, but it doesn't mean we can't win money point spread wise with this team. We'll just have to figure out which direction they're headed early on this year, whether they're going to be a good dog, whether they're going to be a pretty good over team as they were last year, 67% overs out of 12 games. That's a nice team to back where that's concerned. So, this may be a team we'll have to adjust to on the fly. I think they're going to be a little bit better. I really do. And if Muschamp is playing with his feet to the fire, if he's coaching with his feet to the fire, maybe it'll be a good season out of them. But I have to take a wait-and-see approach with these guys. I'm not so sure yet on South Carolina. We'll look through the summer, see how summer practice goes, and maybe develop a little more of a reaction to how to play this team.
Robbie, we got the Missouri Tigers up next, a team you know a lot about. I believe your son went there. 4-4 overall record, 8-5. 8-5 overall record, 4-4 in conference, 5-2 at home, and 3-2 on the road. And one thing I noticed right off the bat, starting off at Wyoming in Laramie, in Laramie, Wyoming. That is the highest elevation Division I football school in the country. So from a team from the SEC going on the road to a Mountain West opponent, that is that's an interesting way to start off your season. I can already tell you this: if you're looking for a side that's going to be kind of, let's say, the quote-unquote sharp angle side, with all this time to prepare for week one, it will be the Wyoming Cowboys, in my opinion, at home, just because of a lot of people like to jump on that, as far as it's a tough place to play. But you also got to keep in mind it's not always about, the place to play. It's SEC athletes versus Mountain West athletes, but you never know what can happen. It might be a good game when all is said and done. But either way, I'll throw it to you with the Missouri Tigers. How are you viewing their 2019 outlook?
Well, they're certainly the wild card in all of this year, Drew, because they're on bowl probation. They can't go to a bowl game due to academic fraud and a situation which cost them their 2019 bowl game. They're on 3-year probation, and they had a 5% scholarship reduction, which only amounts to like 1.5 scholarships, and it only applies to this season. But I bring this up because, remember, Kelly Bryant, the former quarterback from Clemson, transferred here to Mizzou. And a lot of people thought once the suspension came down from the bowl game that Kelly Bryant would walk on Missouri, but he didn't walk. He stayed, had a real good spring practice. In fact, they had 2 quarterback transfers here because they got Sean Robinson, the former quarterback of TCU, to come and play behind Kelly Bryant here. Now, the word or whatever from Mizzou and the early reports from spring practice are that it's a team with an absolute chip on its shoulder. Now, we've seen this before, right? I think Auburn went through a probation year and went undefeated that year. Kids get that proverbial chip on their shoulder and make every game their bowl game. So it'll be very interesting to see this Missouri team, how they react right now, all quotes, and you would expect them to be in the spring, right? Nothing bad has happened yet, but you would expect everything to be all positive, and we're going to play every game like it's our last, that type of deal because of this bowl suspension. They've got some talent here. I mean, for sure, they've got some talent. Now, they lose Drew Lock, obviously, but with Kelly Bryant coming in, it might be a little bit different of an offense with Kelly Bryant's added ability to run the football. But Mizzou has all that stuff in the playbook, so I think he fits right in. The receiving crew here is outstanding. Even though they lost Emmanuel Hall to the draft, he went undrafted. I think he clicked on with the Bears. But when you have guys like Jalen Knox and Jonathan Johnson and Rashad Floyd, all guys who caught big passes last year, and then back it up with Larry Roundtree at running back, and of course Albert O at tight end. This is a good team. Defensively, they've got a couple of corners that rate now amongst the top 2 teams in as far as all SEC is concerned. So they've got talent here, and Barry Odom, who is a coach who not once but twice during his short tenure has apparently been on the way out, somehow has survived each one by coming back strong in the second half of the year. But he seems to have the defense figured out now because that was a major problem when he first took over and he hired DeMonte Cross from TCU. They look much better on defense with Ryan Walters as the DC, and of course the hiring of Derek Dooley last year as offensive coordinator after Josh Heupel took the UCF job. Like I say, as far as the SEC East goes, if you're going to stack them in that next tier with Tennessee, with South Carolina, with Kentucky, and then Missouri, those 4 teams, they might be the most talented of the bunch. I might think that Tennessee is getting on par, but I think Missouri might be the most talented of the bunch, and maybe they'll be worth playing this year if they play with that added chip, Drew. People who, and you hit it on the head, a lot of system stuff or a lot of theory stuff may be on Wyoming at home in week 1. Missouri may come out loaded for bear in week 1, and Wyoming could be in over their heads. So it'll be interesting to see what the summer reports are coming out of this camp. Yeah,
and their schedule at Wyoming and then West Virginia at home. So kind of coming out guns blazing there. For an SEC team, you don't always see that right out of the gate. But let's move down the line here, Robbie. We got Vanderbilt up next in the SEC East, the last bowl team from the division, 6-7 last year, 3-5 in conference. Looking at the schedule for this year, the Georgia Bulldogs off the bat, like we talked about from the Georgia side before, and then off to West Lafayette, Indiana, to face Purdue at a Big Ten team there. They also got Northern Illinois. They pull LSU from the West. Also Ole Miss. They will travel to Oxford, Mississippi, play the Rebels in Vaught Hemingway. They play UNLV as well. And then, of course, at Florida, at South Carolina, they get Kentucky at home, and they're at Tennessee. So a lot of kind of I wouldn't say coin flip games, but the SEC East games, they are on the road for a lot down the stretch here. So either way, what are your thoughts on Vanderbilt here, Robbie?
Well, the first thing with Vandy we'll start with is they are one of two teams. We just talked about the other Missouri. One of only two teams inside this division that loses their quarterback and has to replace their quarterback. The other five squads, aside from Mizzou and Vandy, are good at quarterback with returnees. But here you lose Kyle Shermer, who the past couple of years has been pretty good for Vanderbilt. They are not always a good team throwing the football, but with Shermer, they became a pretty decent, at least a team that you had to respect throwing the football, especially last year when their offense picked up a little bit. Here, surprisingly for Vandy, Drew, they have gone massive as far as the transfer route is concerned. And Vanderbilt has signed what is a all-time high for this program in number of transfers. They've got 9 new guys coming in from other colleges, and 8 of them are immediately eligible. The 9th looks like he will be, but one of the key ones, of course, would be the quarterback, and that quarterback is Riley Neal, who we remember as the quarterback of Ball State in the Mid-American Conference the last couple of years. Riley Neal injured a little bit with Ball State, not only last year, but I think the year before. It's certainly one of the years he sat out much more than he did the other. But Riley Neal, a capable quarterback. We'll see if he's capable of playing in the SEC. That's a pretty big step up from MAC defenses to SEC defenses. So I don't know how well that's going to go. He's in a competition right now, hasn't been handed the starter's job, but he's in a competition with returning junior Deuce Wallace for that starting job. Like I say, when you're trying to fit in so many transfers, Derek Mason, a real good motivator, a real good defensive coach, so maybe he can make this pretty seamless, but I wouldn't count on it for Vandy here to have so many transfers coming in. And it's a couple of them fairly high caliber, Drew, so they do plug some holes where they needed it. So I don't want to make it sound like, oh, well, Vandy's not going to be able to do it, because there's potential. The player potential that they brought in certainly could fill some holes, and they could continue on playing pretty good ball. I think the biggest hole will be at quarterback. I don't know if Riley Neal, he's kind of slightly built, doesn't have the strongest arm. And like I say, coming from the MAC, it's going to be a little bit of a difference here playing against SEC teams. Their schedule, you talked about earlier in the analysis. The non-conference isn't bad. Northern Illinois, UNLV, East Tennessee State, but boy, divisionally it's going to be tough for them. I think where all the other teams, I could almost say, are ascending. South Carolina should be a little bit better at least. Tennessee, I think, is going to be significantly better. Kentucky probably will ride the same, maybe drop a little, but they were noticeably better than Vandy last year. So this is going to be a tough one for them. It always is inside this division. They have one change at coordinator. Jerry Godowski is in his first season as the OC here. Going to step in. This is an interesting thing too, Drew, that I want to mention here real quick. He steps in place of Andy Ludwig, who was here in Nashville for 4 years. Took the job as the OC and QB coach at Utah. But a lot of Vandy fans were complaining about Andy Ludwig's play calling last year. A lot of noise about how they were real happy to see him go. All right, so he goes, but you go ahead and read all the quotes from the spring, and Jerry Godowski's in there to basically call the same plays that Andy Ludwig was calling last year. Got a couple of things here that I'll read off to you that I picked off of a couple articles. And Godowski said the big thing in this transition for all of us offensively was that we don't want a whole bunch of big changes. It really comes down to the nuts and bolts of what we do in communication and terminology. We've got 4 years invested. It's really still Andy's system. So there's no change. When you read that quote from your new OC, I don't know what the difference would be. And like I say, breaking in a new quarterback after having a multi-year starter in there who developed pretty well, it's going to be tough in my estimation for Vanderbilt this season.
Robbie, we got one team left, and guys, do want to say out the podcast coupon code. It is podcast, just PODCAST. At checkout, you could take $300 off Robbie Veno or any handicapper on sportsmemo.com. Their full season NFL and college football up at sportsmemo.com. $300 off using the coupon code podcast at checkout. Robbie, we got the Tennessee Volunteers up next. A down 2018 season, 2-6 in conference, 5-7 overall. Missed out on a bowl game there in Knoxville. Looks like the schedule early on, kind of an easier schedule, but still, given the year they had last year, Georgia State from the Sun Belt, BYU comes to town as well, and then they get a Division I AA or whatever they're calling it now, FCS team, and then at Florida Gators before a bye week. Then got the Georgia Bulldogs. They pull Mississippi State from the SEC West, along with a trip to Alabama. Alabama is their permanent opponent, so they play them every year from the West. And I'm finishing it up with at Missouri and Vanderbilt at home. But your overall thoughts, Robbie, on the Tennessee Volunteers to close out the SEC East?
Yeah, it's weird how it fell apart on them at the end of last year, Drew, because they were in a stretch where they had covered 4 of 6 in the middle of the season. And just listen to the covers. They covered against Georgia. They covered the spread against Auburn. They lose big to Alabama, lose ATS. But then they come back and cover against South Carolina, don't cover against Charlotte in what probably was a flat spot, and then don't just cover but beat Kentucky 24-7. That's 4 quality point spread covers, ticket cashers in a 6-week span. And then they closed the year getting beat by 33 by Missouri and getting beat 25 by Vanderbilt. Just crazy how the last 2 games of the year, coming off a real good stretch, they just fell apart. I think Jeremy Pruitt in his second year, he had to go through a weeding out process last year, Drew, like a lot of head coaches do. What was set in place by Butch Jones, the prior coaching staff, really wasn't the way Jeremy Pruitt is used to seeing things run where he came from, which was Alabama. I think things were run a lot tougher last year. Like I say, they had to go through a weeding out process, but now he's got this program to understand, or at least to develop the culture that he wants there. And I really never think that Tennessee is a team that doesn't have talent. It just wasn't applied the right way. We saw guys walk off of Butch Jones's team during his tenure. Jalen Hurd was the leading rusher for Tennessee like 8 games into the season and just decided to hit the road and transfer to Baylor because of the head coach. So I think it's a different story here and now. I was looking at some position groups for Tennessee this year, and a couple of high spots for them. Bright spots would be the secondary. That looks like it's coming along, and you need a good secondary nowadays. And they had a real good recruiting class. I think offensively, they're going to be able to produce more points here. They went the route of changing both coordinators here. Jim Chaney, long-time, well-respected offensive coordinator from Georgia, comes in to run the show here. That's a big plus. And Derek Ansley is going to run the defense now with Chris Rump continuing as the co-defensive coordinator for this team. So I think under Chaney, you will see a lot more offensive production, a lot more yardage. Tennessee could be, if I had to pick one team inside this division, Drew, that I think would make the biggest leap this year, I think it'll be the Tennessee Volunteers. I think Missouri could do some damage if they have that mental chip the entire season because they don't have the bowl. But for me, If I'm looking for one that might exceed expectations, it would be Tennessee. Now, the crossover games here for them are tough as well. They got to play Alabama, which they do every year, third week of October against Alabama. That's tough. They also play Mississippi State this season, so they don't get any breaks there. But inside this division, they may even pose a threat to rivals Florida and Georgia when they play those two teams this year. I wouldn't sell Tennessee short. It's probably a team I'll look to play on. I've got a little asterisk next to them right now. We'll see. The non-conference is extremely, in my estimation at least, extremely easy. When you get Georgia State at home, when you get Chattanooga at home, when you get UAB at home, you should win all three of those games. The BYU one, of course, could be a little more difficult, but all four non-conference are home in Knoxville, so they get the benefit of the scheduling here.
Robbie, great breakdown of the whole SEC East, man. And are you up for doing the SEC West next week?
Oh, we're absolutely up for the SEC West, Drew. Like we always say, can't get enough of football, especially college football this time of year. So, yeah, I'd be more than happy to come back and break down the SEC West.
Good stuff, Robbie. So, yeah, guys, we'll be doing college football conference and division breakdowns at least once a week here throughout the summer. So along with MLB, NBA playoff, NHL when we can, and the soccer podcasts, we'll add in the college football conference previews at least once a week throughout the summer here. So stay tuned to the Sportsmemo podcast. Thanks for tuning in, guys. And remember the coupon code podcast at checkout for $300 off Robbie Veno or any Sportsmemo handicappers full season NFL and college football. So best of luck with your bets tonight, and we'll be back tomorrow talking tomorrow night's betting card.